Hey, welcome back to the Metropol Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Whispers in Nalubale. This is the fifth and penultimate data pack in the Katara cycle. This one came out about 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, so we're a bit late on the draw here, but we have 20 cards, 10 runner, 10 corp divided right down the middle, and we're going to be talking a bit about them. If you're new to this channel, if you're new to these unboxing videos, basically what we do is we run through the cards, talk a bit about the flavor behind them, what they do, some combinations of other cards you can play them with, and give a bit of an analysis in a mixture of both, I hope at least, the competitive and the casual scenes. There's timestamps in the description below if there's a certain card you want to jump to specifically, but otherwise we're going to start right here at the top. I think it's card 100. Or actually no, before we jump into that, let's just talk about this name here. Yeah, Whispers in Nalubale. That's how it's pronounced. It's Nalubale. I've heard people say this in a lot of different ways. What's that name about? Well, the cycle so far has been going about the new beanstalk, the new space elevator that's being built on the edges of the coast of Lake Victoria, and that's Lake Victoria there in the middle of Africa. And Nalubale is actually the Lugandan, which is a language in Uganda. It's their name for Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is an English name. It was named by John Hanning Speke, the first Briton to document it. And if you want a map, this is Africa. Here is Lake Victoria, and if you want a finer map, this is Lake Victoria, and you actually see a lot of the places in Netrunner we've been seeing on the edges of Lake Victoria. There's Mwanza, which I think we'll get to in this pack. You see Ginger there's on the top, Kampala, that'll be coming up real soon, but this is where we are, Lake Victoria, otherwise known as Lake Nalubale. Or is it just Nalubale? It's just Nalubale, that probably says lake in there. Anywho, card 100. This is Freedom Khumalo, the crypto anarchist. This is an anarch identity, has no link, is a cyborg subtype. That hasn't mattered just yet. It's a 45 deck size, 15 influence, and has quite a strong ability. It says once per turn, you may remove X virus counters from your installed cards to trash a card that you access at no cost, even if that cannot normally be trashed. And X is the card's res or play cost. So when you're accessing a card, look at this res or play cost, remove virus counters, go ahead and trash. It's important to know that agendas do not have res or play costs. You're never going to be able to trash agendas, but every other type of card that the corp should be running or have in their deck, you'll be able to trash. And quite the ability. This looks like a combination of two pretty strong identities, anarch identities. One of them is Wizard, a card that has rotated out. This used to be in the first cycle that's no longer tournament legal. And Wizard was one of the most competitive anarch identities on the fact that 3 recurring credits, specifically against metas that had competitive metas, that had a lot of assets and upgrades, was an immense amount of value. And it's a combination of Wizard, because you get value, you're trashing assets for free, and Edward Kim. And Edward Kim is still a legal identity. It is from Order and Chaos. It will always be evergreen in the tournament card pool. And it's a combination. It not only puts pressure on assets, but also puts on pressure in operations. While there are some limitations. And let's talk about the asset side, because the asset side is actually way more exciting than I thought it would be. And that's on the basis that we've been seeing so many assets, and I've been talking about this a lot, looking at the assets that have been coming out for the last 2 years or so, is that the numbers on these assets are crazy. We have so many, what I would consider must-trash assets that if you don't deal with can easily lose you the game, that have really cheap res costs and very expensive trash costs. And generally when you're trashing assets, you're dealing with this number at the bottom, but now you're dealing with the number at the top. And there's just so many situations where now that's so much more favorable to you. Moving 2 virus counters instead of paying 5 is crazy. We've seen this time and time again, cards where the ratios are crazy, and you need to deal with generally a lot of assets in these decks, so they're generally running a lot of these, and you can trash all of these for relatively cheap as long as you have virus counters. This is also such a huge counter to Industrial Genomics, a deck that generally wants to bloat the trash costs of their assets and upgrades, and you start to not care, which is fantastic. Well, on its own, that's pretty good. That gives you some Wizard flexibility. Now, we have to build a deck that gets virus counters. We'll get to that in a second. But also, again, we are like Edward Kim, or it's like having a permanent imp on the table, and there's a lot of value in that. Being able to run central servers and trash cards puts pressure on the corporation. Not only do they have to ice their central servers if they want to keep their cards, but it also... I'm interested to see whether people are going to change what decks they build based on the existence of Freedom. Because one of the best ways you can get value out of Freedom is when X equals 0. If you're running turn 1 with Freedom and you have no virus counters, you can remove 0 virus counters from your installed cards to trash a card with a play or res cost of 0. And there's a lot of really strong cards that have 0 printed in the top left card. And these are common win conditions in decks. And the idea that you can run against what's it called? A Titan Transnational deck and trash an Audacity, or against any yellow deck and trash their exchange of information, is nuts. And that removes win conditions from these decks and really puts the pressure on them. Now, if you have a couple virus counters, you can also deal with other bigger win conditions that, well, you have to spend some virus counters, but the ability to remove a consulting visit or trash a consulting visit is really strong. Getting rid of hard-hitting news is really good. A lot of times that's how corps want to punish and win the game. Cards like Neural EMP, which you're expecting to have in those grind decks, you can get rid of those instead of them getting rid of your cards, which is really fun too. Now, Medium is not in the game anymore, but there's also a value in Freedom when it comes to multi-axis. Imagine you're running R&D and you see the top card and it's a card that you trash. You can now run R&D again and see another card. And just like Edward Kim, the ability to run R&D twice in a turn and see 2 different cards, let alone trashing one of them, is incredibly valuable. I haven't crunched the numbers in a while, but when I learned Netrunner, the number that was taught to me is you need to get like 17 different accesses on central servers to have about a 50% chance of scoring 7 agenda points. I don't know if any of those numbers hold up anymore, but that's the idea, is if you're getting 2 accesses instead of 1 in a turn, it greatly increases your chances of finding agenda. That's just a good thing to do whether or not you're trashing, and multi-axis is not that strong anymore, and this has built-in multi-axis and built-in central pressure. It's also totally worth noting that Freedom makes running central servers fun. A lot of times you'll run a central server as just about any identity. You'll see a card, you'll be like, oh, okay, they have a biotic labor, they have some card, and you can't deal with it. And Freedom makes every central server access more exciting, and that's really fun. The idea that it's like, oh, I hope I find something that's like 3 to trash and you can trash it. And I like that. I think that's actually just fun to play as. Now, how do you get value out of Freedom? You want to be running every turn. This ability is once per turn, so every turn you want to have a chance to trash something. And whether you're playing against an asset deck, that might be easier because they have unprotected assets, but a lot of times you want to be running central servers. Those combo cards that the corp is depending on, their Audacities, their Consultings, their hard-hitting news, they're going to be in HQ, so you want to get in and deal with them. So you want to make that as cheap as possible. How do you do that? There's cards like this. Cards like Mining Accident. Having bad publicity is really good. It makes running cheaper. It makes running multiple times a turn cheaper, if we're talking about that multi-axis trashing thing. And this is the sort of stuff that I would assume you'd want in a Freedom deck. Get those runs in, make them cheap. You have other options like Cyber Feeder. This actually might see a bit more play. It's 1 credit a turn if you're running with Icebreakers, but also helps you install viruses. I think you're going to be playing a fair bit of viruses in your Freedom deck. And you also might want to look into other options, cards like Multi-Threader that makes running cheap. If you're running every turn, that's good. Also, Ice Destruction is a very valuable tool. Again, we're going to get to this in a second. Maybe we're putting the horse, or the cart in front of the horse, excuse me. But if you're trashing the corpse ice, it's easier for you to get into central servers and get those Freedom accesses. It's easier to build up virus counters. So Freedom inherently might be more interested in Ice Destruction. And not only that, Freedom has built-in Ice Destruction. And this is not something we've mentioned just yet, but Ice has res costs. And so if you get into a central server and maybe you do have 6 virus counters, you can trash that endless EULA before it hits the table, and that's really powerful because, again, less ice means easier to get virus counters, easier to get accesses, and we start to hit that snowball, which at some point you might be able to trash just about anything, and that's really exciting. So again, maybe the cart is in front of the horse. How do we get virus counters? Because if you're playing Freedom, you want virus counters. And there's a lot of really cool ways to do this. And I've been really excited for the Freedom deck building because I've seen a lot of different options. A lot of people are tackling this in different ways. And it's exciting to see what's going to stick. This is Virus Breeding Grounds, a card that came out in Order and Chaos that was largely considered to be too slow of a card and saw minimal play in some combo virus decks that did very little else but sit back. But Virus Breeding Grounds is actually really good with Freedom. Freedom is one of the few cards that uses virus counters regardless of what card they come off of. That was a problem with Virus Breeding Grounds. If you wanted to move the virus counters, it was very slow. It took clicks, but Freedom doesn't care. Put Virus Breeding Ground down as soon as you can in a game, and by turn 5, you have 5 virus counters, which means you can trash some good stuff, and it's hard to deal with that. The corp is probably not going to be as likely to purge if you're getting these counters for free, regardless whether or not you interact with them. And this is also not a unique card. 3 virus counters a turn is really scary. A very similar card that came out this cycle is Friday Chip. You might want to figure out what works better for your deck. If you're trashing installed cards, Friday Chip might be better because he also lets you move counters. But a lot of times, actually, I think the VBG, the Virus Breeding Grounds, might actually be just easier to play. You put this down, forget about it. That's all you need to do. This one is a bit more conditional. Nabakiri also is the console that's largely attributed to Freedom. I think he's holding it right there. But I found in a lot of my testing is that this card specifically was a bit too expensive and not flashy enough. It gives you 1 virus counter per turn. It lets you put it on the card that you want. Kind of like a faster Friday Chip without any trashing. And that's okay. Getting 3 MU is also part of the biggest deal with this console, but I'm seeing a lot of people, myself included, that's not that excited to pay 5 credits for this card. It just seems too slow and expensive. If you're installing all these other cards, you're pretty slow anyways, so I just don't want to go even slower. Other cards like Incubator are really cool. This card just kind of actually similar to Virus Breeding Grounds, but has some scary burst potential. You have this card that has a name. This card actually is a lot better than I thought it'd be, and that's because you have the pressure with Freedom. If you put this on a central server on R&D, every time you run R&D, you can trash things of 2 or less. And if the corp doesn't purge next turn, it's 4 or less, and this gets out of control. Pair that with something like a Data Sucker, and now every single run you're making has a big chance of hitting something good, getting those big virus counters, and going ahead and trash stuff. Let alone Data Sucker is just a good card on its own. If you're running some of the other breakers, the heat breakers, having Data Suckers actually can save you a fair bit of money. And even on its own, just Freedom plus Data Sucker is not a terrible deck. Central servers, get those counters. You got to figure out when to use them though, and that's kind of interesting. The idea is that Freedom is using a resource that's valuable for other cards. Your Data Sucker tokens are good as Data Sucker tokens, but when do you intelligently use them to trash hard-hitting news? I think that's fun and actually opens up a high skill cap of play that I'm excited to see. You have other wackier options, cards like Pheromones that maybe is not the best use because you kind of want to keep the counters on here. Hemorrhage is largely like another copy of Data Sucker, a bit slower. Gravedigger kind of looks like it would work well, but it's important to understand that this has installed corp card, so it doesn't really synergize that well. And you also have Yusuf, and let me tell you, Yusuf is surprisingly, at least to me, one of the best Khumalo cards. I would actually consider playing 3 of these in Freedom decks just because this turn 1 is nuts. And that's also like a pretty hard thing. I think people probably wouldn't have thought that before. This is a Fractor. It breaks barriers, and Anarchs right now have the best Fractor in the game. This is Paperclip. It's almost unconditionally one of the best Fractors in the game. And competing with another Fractor seems weird why you'd ever play Yusuf over Paperclip, but this is like a Data Sucker for every central server. And that's kind of crazy. This is actually one of the best anti-asset spam cards in the game, specifically in Freedom. If you put Yusuf down on the table and now you're running remote servers, every remote server you run, you get 1 virus counter, which means it's very easy for you to trash things like this for free. You get 1 Yusuf down, you can get 2 Yusufs down, I guess. It's all your MU. But you're starting to trash things for free. 1 Yusuf and 1 Virus Breeding Ground, you're good to go. Let alone this is a breaker, and if you have virus counters, it lets you get into servers. It's just honestly fine. I realize now that we forgot to talk a bit about the name of Khumalo. We're backpedaling here. Khumalo is actually a name from an African clan originally in northern KwaZulu, which is South Africa. There's not too much history here on Wikipedia. That's largely all I have to say, but it came from that, I guess. There's also like footballers that have the name Khumalo, so it might actually just be a common enough last name. Maybe I'm missing something here. Let me know if I am. We also got programs, right? Amaku is a really good card. It's a super good card. It also spirals out of control if you can get those good accesses on central servers. And I think people might be fast to try and put these 2 in the same deck. And while I think it is possible, I think you might want to be a bit careful. Amakua doesn't get counters if you fire Freedom's ability. And if you're using Freedom's ability to take counters off Amakua, you're kind of going to get yourself nowhere. So do watch out. Maybe a different option you want to try is God of War, which while that probably is a tag me deck at that point. A lot of times you have more counters on God of War than you need, and this is the only card in the game that gives you 2 virus counters unconditionally. Where you don't have to run, you don't have to do anything, and that might actually be enough Freedom value. It's cool. It's a really interesting ability. I also think one really cool thing about this ID, this is the first operation you access, you trash it, and this is once per turn, which gives another like additional skill cap to this. You could be running central servers and think like, I know they have 1 card in here, or I know I'm going to lose against these 2 cards. I'm going to run HQ, and you see a different card, and you think like, okay, I'm not going to trash that. I'm going to run again. And that is cool. I think it's much more interesting. And another good thing about this ability or this identity is that it's actually much more flexible. There are some Netrunner decks that you can play that have like excuse me, there's some competitive corps or even not competitive corps that might not even have operations, and you have a chance of playing a dead identity. Something like Edward Kim just might not be that good. And the same thing with Wizard. That was the issue, is that you could be playing against certain corps that don't have enough assets or upgrades, and that it could be a dead identity. And this combines both of them and ensures that no matter what, and across so many archetypes and so many corporate factions and identities, that this will be a relevant ability. It really doesn't matter what you're playing against, this will be a relevant ability, which is not something you can say 100% of the time with either Edward Kim or the Wizard. So say you're playing against a Consulting Visit deck, or excuse me, Controlling the Message deck, you know you're going to get some freedom value. Not only are they going to be running things you have to trash, mind you, trashing Undead Virtual Tool for 0 is going to be pretty sweet. You can trash their hard-hitting news, their exchange of information, stuff like that in hand, super flexible. Maybe you're playing against a Wayland Kill deck. You know you're going to be trashing some of their operations. Trash this for 0. Trash their C sources. Maybe they're running prize decks. You trash all this for 0. If they're playing against an HB deck, you can trash their fast events. You can trash some ice. You can trash their econ. It's good no matter what. And I like that. That makes me more excited to play Freedom than either Kim or Wizard. They have a chance of just being a bad meta choice if you're going to a tournament and you expect there to be a lot of assets and there's not. And then your Wizard looks silly. Mind you, again, Wizard is no longer a legal identity. How do you play against Freedom? It's kind of difficult. There's definitely some cards you can play in your deck that will just improve your chances. Cards like Cyberdeck's Virus Suite are definitely going to be useful. There's no doubt that Freedom is going to be running viruses. Having a card that lets you purge at instant access sometimes can make some really good surprises where the runner thinks they're going to get into a server and trash something with the virus counters they have. Maybe their breakers fall apart. That's really cool. You also have Macrophage, which is not a terrible card on its own. Freedom, mind you, doesn't have Link. This deals with a lot of viruses all at once. Another big option is just to run big old ice, because Freedom probably is, I could see a lot of Freedom decks snowballing, trashing cheap things and getting a lot of runs on central servers, building up their counters, Data Sucker, Plague. And if you have big ice on all central servers, that actually might be an issue, and you have expensive cards, but it's hard. It's really hard. A problem also I've been seeing with Freedom that I'm actually interested to see how people deal with it in different ways is that things get clumsy. For the last year and a half, for better or worse, most competitive Anarch decks have had the same shell of 20, 25 neutral and Anarch cards. And there's just certain things that your deck needs to do to be reliable enough. A lot of times you need install cards, you need economy, you need a draw. And the most common draw engine in Anarch right now is Inject. And Inject actually works really poorly with viruses. This card draws a lot, trashes a lot, which is really good when you're running things like the Conspiracy Breakers, which have been very common for a long time now, but actually really bad when you're running things like Yusuf that get trashed. So a lot of times, well, I think Anarchs right now are trying to figure out how to make a good draw engine in Freedom. There's still a lot of choices. You can definitely still play Earthrise. That's good. You may even consider Vigil, but this seems a bit counter synergistic if you're trashing cards from HQ. Obelisk, maybe that's not terrible. Maybe you're running central servers every turn to get a trash. There's some value in here. But Freedom inherently does seem a bit slow and clumsy. There's a lot of support cards you need to install. There's a lot of cards that you want to draw if you want to get all your viruses down while you're still trying to assert pressure. It's difficult, and there's a lot of things that need to be polished, and I'm excited to see where that goes. Other things you might want to consider if the Corp wants to purge, maybe make it bad for them. Cards like Acacia came out this cycle. This is an economy card. Maybe that's what you need. You have some spicier things. Cards like Fester that make the purge worse, and cards like Populist Rally that technically make it impossible purge if that's something that you value doing. But overall, I have really cool things to say about Freedom. It's an interesting card. It makes you manage your resources in a cool way that no other identity really does, and it's good against just about any matchup. And I like this. I think this is really cool. Anarch. The viruses are much more interesting to me now than they were when Noise was around, where a lot of times the best strategy was just install all of them and hope it works out. That's Freedom. And the next two card in this pack, and again, I think there's only been 2 cards this whole cycle that don't have the word virus on it. We're still going, and we got some viruses. This is Tripano. I've heard people on the internet either say Tripano or Tripano. I can't figure out what's right. Maybe we'll never know. It costs 2 to install. It's a program. It's an Anarch program. It takes up 1 MU. It's a virus. No surprise. And it says install Tripano only on a piece of ice. When Tripano has 5 or more virus counters on it, you trash the host ice. And when your turn begins, you may place a virus counter on Tripano, twisting, writhing, ripping into all that it touches. It's also a pretty reasonable 3 influence. So what is Tripano? Tripano is a parasite. It's a group of unicellular parasitic flagellate protozoa. The name Tripano is from Greek meaning borer, something that digs in, and that shouldn't be a surprise. This is going to be digging into your ice and destroying it. This is what Tripano looks like underneath a microscope amongst some red blood cells, and check how good the art is. Very evocative of that. I wouldn't be surprised if this card specifically was a reference to the African trypanosomiasis, which is it's also known as a sleeping sickness, which is an insect-borne parasitic disease that you largely get from the bite of an infected tsetse fly. I think I'm saying that right. It sounds pretty terrible. 1 to 3 weeks after you get the bite, the fever sets in, the headaches, the itchiness, joint pains. Eventually you start getting confused, numb, you have trouble sleeping. Eventually you fall into a coma and you die. It seems really serious. I believe this can be treated if you can identify it, but it is a thing that happens, and we're in Africa. Maybe this is African trypanosomiasis. Either way, this is a trypanoparasite, and it's really scary, whether it's a parasite or whether it's trashing your ice. I hope that's not insensitive. This is Parasite. Parasite was one of the strongest cards in Netrunner, and thankfully it has rotated out. This is one of the cards that was in the original core set that's no longer in the revised core set. And Michael Boggs, or whoever writes the marketing pieces for this cycle, specifically said that there's a lot of inherent parts of the different runner identities that don't exactly exist in the revised core set, considering they made no new cards in the revised core set. But these cards are going to be reprinted in a more balanced way within the Katara cycle, which is why the Katara cycle is so exciting. And this is the more balanced version of Parasite. And from a distance, it might be very obvious, but Parasite is way better than Tripano. Tripano is a much worse card than Parasite, but almost all the cards ever printed are much worse cards than Parasite, so that's not really saying too much. I want to take a minute to talk about Parasite, just because Parasite is a very interesting card, and I think there's still a lot of design holes that are left in Netrunner now that Parasite is gone. And if you read the text on Parasite, it's just like Tripano, you install it on a piece of ice. After a couple turns, the ice dies. Tripano doesn't care what the ice is, and it takes 5 turns, while Parasite actually cares about the ice strength. And it also reduces the ice strength every turn. And that's actually a very interesting thing, and I'm surprised to some extent that Tripano doesn't deal with that. And that's because a big part of at least in the core set identity, in the revised core set identity of Anarchs, deals with these fixed strength breakers. Breakers that are inherently unable to interact with a large portion of the ice in the ice pool. But with cards like Parasite that were able to reduce the strength, you can now use your Morningstar on big barriers, or your Mimic eventually gets through a bigger sentry. And that no longer exists. Tripano is not filling that niche at all. Now, the problem with Parasite was anything that reduced the ice strength of ice to 0 was a problem, because things immediately just got blown up. It didn't matter what your ice was, it was going to die immediately. And there's a video on this channel where we talk about at length of how absurd the design on Sifr is, but that's no longer a problem anymore, let alone this card is banned. But like, Data Sucker was a problem with Parasite. It kind of snowballs out of control. Eventually, if you have a bunch of Data Sucker tokens, any ice can be immediately blown up. It was a very negative play space, and it snowballed out of control, because if your ice gets destroyed, you get more Data Sucker tokens. It goes on and on and on. Now, since the beginning of Netrunner, Android Netrunner, ice was balanced in a way that had Parasite in mind. A lot of the times you would see, if you had ice had high strength, a lot of times it only had 1 subroutine. And then on the other side, you have ice that has a lot of subroutines, that was very expensive to break as well, but only had low strength. And a lot of this design was actually almost 100% balanced around Parasite. The idea is that your tour guide could have 15 subroutines, and it could cost you 15 credits to get through this with a lot of breakers, but at the end of the day, this thing immediately evaporated from Parasite. Its strength actually mattered. Same idea with Next Silver. This could have 7 to 8 subroutines, but at the end of the day, it could get immediately blown up by Parasite. And sure, there are still some instances where, or in most instances, the amount of the strength does depend, or it does affect how much money you have to spend breaking it with certain programs, but a lot of the times it doesn't matter. 1 strength, Next Silver, it's never going to matter the strength, so at least it doesn't have 5 strength, I guess. That's all gone. There's very few cards in the game that care about the strength of the ice, besides just the mathematical boosting ice, and I think that's kind of not the best right now in the game. I think this is the only card right now is Prey that actually cares about the strength of the ice. So an ice like Komainu is technically really weak to ice destruction, but not Tripano, only Prey and old Parasite. It's also one of the big reasons I continually complain about how absurd Kakugo is, and Kakugo probably wouldn't be broken if Parasite was around. If Parasite was around, maybe Kakugo would strictly not even be playable, but this is the sort of design that made a lot of sense when Parasite was around. It was like, okay, an absurdly good ice at a pretty fair cost, but it was weak to ice destruction because it had low strength, and That just doesn't exist anymore, which is weird. At the end of the day, if you have a Tripano, the Chiashi, the mighty Chiashi, or the weak pop-up window, no matter what, they're going to be dying in 5 turns. Usually a bit less, but that's strange. That's really strange to me. This does obviously balance the card. You're not going to have any more times with enough virus counters. Your Chiashi is just going to immediately disappear, which is probably good for the game because it makes bigger strength ice more interesting, but now bigger strength ice and low strength ice are kind of all the same, and at least when it comes to ice destruction. Not the biggest fan of that. That's, I think, all we're going to talk about Parasite. Let's specifically talk about Tripano because it is still a relevant card. It is ice destruction, and that's always going to be good. So, when you install Tripano, every turn it gets a virus counter. When there's 5, the ice melts. The pop-up window melts. Is that slow? That is very slow, and it gives the corpse some time to do some sort of counterplay. If it has 4 counters on your ice, or the Tripano has 4 counters on it, you can always purge. And whether you're going to play Tripano as a card that says every 3 to 4 turns the corp loses a click, or loses, 3 clicks their whole turn to purge virus counters, is that worth it? It might be. To me, that probably isn't. I think the corp can just go fast enough, and if there's just one big piece of ice that you're waiting to get destroyed, especially if it's on a scoring remote, they can probably just rush behind it. So I don't think that's on its own good enough. So if you're playing Tripano, you're probably playing support cards, and there's still a lot of good support cards. Just like everything we talked about in our friend here, Freedom Kamalo, works really well with Tripano, because Tripano wants more virus counters. Cards like Virus Breeding Grounds make this very interesting, because now the corp has to think, Tripano gets 1 counter at the beginning of turn, your 1 copy of Virus Breeding Grounds, mind you could have 2, also gets a counter. So now next turn they can spend like 2 clicks moving 2 counters over and destroying the ice, and it makes it much harder for the corp to purge, because no matter what, you can always spend a bunch of your time with Virus Breeding Grounds moving counters over, and it always makes the ice destruction threat, while time intensive and click intensive, makes it still exist. It also makes things into this like wild push your luck game where the corp sees like, okay, the runner could spend 3 clicks to trash my ice this turn. Maybe I purge now, or maybe I wait next turn, because they're more likely to not do this turn, because next turn they might only use 2 clicks because both of these things take up. It's interesting, and it makes it a bit like of a stakes betting game, and I kind of like that. Also, for what it's worth, in Freedom, where you just want virus counters just ticking up on your cards anyways because you want to trash things, Tripano is in a lot of ways just kind of similar to having another Virus Breeding Grounds, where it's just another way that you're getting free virus counters that you can use to trash cards that you access. While it's going to be shutting down your Tripano, so be it. Why do I have Yusuf here? I don't know why I brought this slide up. But Yusuf's a card. You can also play Nob Curie, which is really cool. Oh yeah, because like this is another way that you can get counters for Yusuf, right? Like it's just another way that builds virus counters, and sometimes you just need virus counters if you're relying on Yusuf, or maybe we're seeing other virus breakers come up in the near future. Nob Curie, again, just like Freedom, gives you a virus counter, can make your Tripano eat through things a bit faster. Incubator is technically really scary. If there's 5 counters on Incubator, you can immediately blow up 1 piece of ice, and whether or not that's worth playing, I don't know, but it's definitely a threat, and I think this is probably the more fun, exciting combo. This is Hive Mind. If at any point in the game you have 5 virus counters on Hive Mind, every card that you install Tripano on it will immediately die. And that can be really scary when combined with other cards that let you find your Tripanos at instant speed. Whether you want to play Tripano Hive Mind in Shaper, and so you can self-modify and code out multiple Tripanos and immediately just obliterate a server once your Hive Mind has 5 counters on it, so be it. You also have cards like Clone Chip, which are pretty cool with Tripano because it's a card that will trash itself inevitably, and you can reinstall it. But now you can instant speed Clone Chip, Hive Mind, Ice, and that could be fun. I could see like a Haley combo deck that wants to have 1 big turn, maybe with Hyperdriver and Equivocation, and you can melt all the ice on R&D and go absolutely nuts and see a bunch of cards all at once. And that's actually really possible, because another big difference between Tripano and Parasite is Tripano works on any ice. It does not have to be rezzed, which means you can just blow up a server out of nowhere even if the runner or the corp doesn't res their ice, which has some value. Whether or not that's better than just like a combo Apocalypse deck, it probably isn't, but it's something you can do. There's a chance that Hive Mind Shaper could be a thing. Whether or not it's competitive, I don't know. Tripano's fine. It's definitely a fine card. You're having this problem again that we brought up with all the viruses. It's a particularly bad card when it comes with the standard shell of Inject that people are using in Anarch decks to draw their cards, because Tripano will trash itself and it's useless in the heap. I have seen a bunch of people start to use Clone Chip as their restricted card. Mind you, this is now currently a restricted card, so that they can inject, and then they'll have their Yusufs and their Trippinos in the bin, and they can Clone Chip onto ice. There's also some value in Clone Chipping a Trippino on ice anyways, because if you Clone Chip on the corpse turn, the ice, your turn will start and it will have an extra counter on it. In some ways, it might speed some things up, so that's cool. I actually highly recommend you trying out Scavenge. Scavenge costs the same amount of influence as Trippino, but it's not a restricted card. While it doesn't happen at instant speed, this is an event that does things. It's actually really cool in Anarch, because you have to trash an installed program, and you can trash your Heat Breakers a lot of times. You can trash an MK Ultra to install your Trippino for free, and no matter what, this one's probably coming back. I think this is actually worth looking into. Another big difference between Trippino and Parasite, I know we said it before, but actually Parasite represented an answer to Ice. If I was rushing an agenda behind Ice turn 1 or turn 2 against Anarch, and say I put a Vanilla in front of it, and Vanilla might not be that common of a card right now. Mind you, also, Freedom trashes Vanilla. Just some good zero-cost Ice. It was a way. It was another thing that you had to play around. It's like, okay, they could have their Barrier Breaker. They could have a Parasite to get through my Ice with Data Suckers. And Trippino doesn't do that, which actually slows down... really does slow down Anarchs. It's more about a card that's about planning for the future. It's knowing that, like, okay, I know in my deck I maybe want to put on a lot of HQ pressure. Maybe I'm playing Freedom and HQ pressure is really good. So I'm going to put this on the HQ ice, and I know in 3 to 4 turns the ice will be trashed, hopefully, and then I can put my pressure on there. You also have to, like, think maybe I want to put this on the remote server, because this looks like a deck that wants to put everything in the remote server and score in there. Maybe I want to dismantle that. Maybe I want to put it on R&D. But this card, you have to plan 2-3 turns in the future, and that's really exciting. That generally makes for cool play. It makes for people that can see what the game looks like 2-3 turns in the future, lets them excel, and that kind of really highlights good play. Again, high skill cap card. Also, for what it's worth, maybe trashing Ice is really good right now, because Recursion isn't that strong, and if decks are only running 14 pieces of Ice, and only in a game they draw like maybe 10 of them if they're lucky, trashing 2 or 3 of them actually can be a pretty good setback. Also lets you get in central servers, so you can get those virus counters with Freedom. It snowballs pretty well. If Trippino gets really popular, there's some things you can do, mind you, because this is a card that will be on the table a couple turns. Cards like Magnet actually get a lot better. This is not a bad card on its own. It costs 3 to break with Black Orchestra. That's totally fine. It's like an Enigma. But it also has a chance of eating the Trippinos, and I think that's pretty cool. Also, again, if Program Destruction, or Ice Destruction, excuse me, gets popular, Architect is always just a good card, but... it's weird. Trippino is, I think it's a bit too slow. It's probably a bit too slow. If you have a wild deck that has all this like Hive Mind support, you're probably going to have to set up really quickly to put the pressure on. But there is still that looming threat of instant pseudo parasite with things like Hive Mind, and that's always going to be alluring to a lot of players. Whether that ever gets to be rolling fast enough, we'll find out really soon. I think you might see this card in regional season popping up in some strange combo decks. On its own, it's not bad. It trashes Ice, just maybe a bit too slowly. I guess we'll find out. Speaking of maybe too slowly, this is Contaminate. It's the last Anarch card in this pack. It costs 1 to play. It's an event. It says place 3 virus counters on an installed runner card with no host of virus counters. What kind of maniac infects their own rig? 1 influence. And this is the spiritual successor to Surge. Unfortunately, this card has less yelling on it, which is less fun for a lot of people. Place 3 virus counters on a card with no hosted virus counters. And that's actually a really important clause. And I've been saying this a bunch this cycle, but I've actually been really happy about the templating on the new cards this cycle so far. And that's because a lot of their like conditions, like their trigger abilities, have the word may in front of them. And I think that makes it really cool. And it makes cards like Contaminate much more easy to use. Notice how cards like Trippino say, when your turn begins, you may place 1 virus counter on Trippino. That means that it's a valid play to say, no, I'm not putting a virus counter and then contaminating it. And if this card forced you to put a virus counter on it, it would be strictly worse. It also makes it easier to deal with rules. If you missed the trigger, you didn't like goof the rules, you just didn't do it. But like Virus Breeding Grounds, you have to put a virus counter on there. So it's going to be nearly impossible to contaminate your Virus Breeding Grounds unless you take the virus counters off of it. Maybe install that turn, but probably not the best play anyways. I think that's cool. It's very flexible. So why would you ever play Contaminate in your deck? Why do you want virus counters? Well, we just talked about that Trippino. This speeds up your Trippino by 3 turns as long as you can do it on the turn that it's good. on a turn that has no virus counters on it, which means either the turn you install it, so maybe you install it, maybe you contaminate it, and then maybe you move 2 counters from virus breeding grounds. Maybe you're spending a whole turn to trash 1 piece of ice. Again, that's kind of why Trippino sounds a bit slow to me, but that might be an option. I think where this might see more play is cards like Amakua. If you have Amakua out, it depends. It's only good if it has virus counters on it. And if the core purges and has ice on all their central servers or all servers, it's hard to get Amakua counters. So similar to Dean Lister, you can play Contaminate as your pocket solution to that. You can put 3 counters on your Amakua, and maybe 3 strength is enough to get into archives twice, and now it's 5 strength, and now you can run the remote server. Maybe a bit more clumsy than Dean Lister, but it gets up to 3 strength for the whole turn, for the rest of the game if the corp doesn't purge, and that's technically valuable. You can even, in theory, pair these together, but for 1 influence, let's do it. This actually might be a pretty fair combo, and by fair I mean interactive. You can put 3 counters on Gravedigger if it's empty, and then spend your next 3 turns milling 3 cards off the corp. So it's not hard to have a turn in which you just say, Contaminate, mill, mill, mill. And if you can make a deck that can do that reliably every turn, that's kind of scary. You might need to put pressure on remote servers just so they don't score out, but like you could Shadow Net Contaminates over and over again. Maybe you need to play some fan sites. But like you can just graveyard, like you can make a deck that like mills 18 plus cards with just Gravedigger sitting back. Again, you're gonna want to put pressure on remote servers, so maybe God of War is your easiest way to do it. But then maybe you're playing Resources, which is not good. But there's definitely something here. This is Shikana, a card that we went too far there. A card that might actually see some play now because it's not a bad virus and its ability is actually relatively strong, specifically if there's a lot of corps playing 5/3 agendas. And you can install Shikana and you can go ahead and contaminate it, and now it is online. And that means in the next turn, if the corp install it, advance their agenda, you don't know whether it's a 5/3 agenda, you don't know whether it's an NGO front. They have to do some more clumsy stuff and keep it safe for another turn, which might be the turn you need to get into that remote server. Maybe you just needed 1 more turn to draw cards, get credits. That's really good. And at the end of the day, if they score on an agenda, you score an agenda, Shikana is still online until they purge. And if they purge, just run R&D, contaminate maybe again, and that's really good. Contaminate also pairs with all the other things that cycle, things like Acacia. It's technically a weak econ card because if they purge, you get money. With Consume, it's like 2 clicks for 5 credits if you want to do it. It's like a worse version of a Lucky Find. A much worse version of Lucky Find. This card's no longer in the tournament card pool. Playing it with like other weird stuff. Like I should Contaminate Pheromones. It's like a fair bit of value. It gets 3 recurring credits to run HQ next turn, and that snowballs out of control. There's cool things you can do with this card. It's worth noting that there are other programs that use virus counters. I think Amakua is by far the best one, but you can look up Darwin. You can look into Crypsis as well. There's technically options. Now again, problem with this card is when you draw it on its own, it does nothing. So just like all the other stuff we've said with Anarch, you want to put this in a deck that draws really well because you're going to be running a lot of weird combo cards. And just top decking this when you wanted to top deck either Economy or a Breaker, it's going to be an issue. So just figure out good card draw, because anytime you have a card in your deck that's dead on its own, just make sure your card draw is good enough. But Contaminate will definitely see pocket play, specifically for 1 influence. Amakuas, they be getting strong out of any faction. We've hit our criminal cards. Give me 1 second to clear a bunch of these tabs. What's the chance I'm talking too fast? I feel like I'm talking really fast right now. We'll hope for the best. This is Embezzle. It's a criminal card. Cost 1, it's an operation. It's a run event and a sabotage. It says make a run on HQ. If successful, instead of accessing cards, name Acid, Ice, Operation, or Upgrade. Then you gotta reveal 2 cards from HQ at random. If any of those revealed cards, or I'll just read it. Trash each revealed card that has the named type, then gain 4 credits for each card trashed this way. So run HQ, name a type. Don't access those cards, mind you. You only reveal them. And if you're correct, you not only trash them, which sometimes saves you money, sometimes it just trashes an operation, which is something you can't generally trash, but then you also gain money back. And there's also a chance you pay 1 credit, break a bunch of ice, get into HQ, reveal cards, and you do nothing, which seems pretty bad. But this is what Embezzle is. I love the art. So, Criminals lost one of their big HQ pressure cards. They lost the Count Siphon. It's one of the cards that didn't make it into the revised core set. We're still waiting on its reprint, its spiritual reprint, probably in the next pack, this cycle. But Account siphon represented a lot of things. It represented a way to run HQ and get money, so it just represented economy, but it also represented turn 1 pressure from criminal. If you're a corporation and you're playing against a criminal back before the revised core set day, generally you'd always ice HQ, because if you didn't ice HQ, the runner could just slam you with an account siphon and things would be really bad. And that's one of the better things about Embezzle, is that it does represent a fairly strong threat for turn 1 against corporations. If the corporation doesn't ice HQ against criminal, they probably don't have a lot of ice in their hand, or they don't expect Embezzle. And if they don't have ice in their hand, maybe they ice 2 central servers and you can still get into HQ in the early game and hit Embezzle. Not only is it, well, it's good, because in that case you don't say ice. Because if they had ice, they would have put it on HQ or somewhere else. Yeah, it's technically an early game pressure card, and if you get an Embezzle out and it lands, in the wild case that it lands, it's like a 9 credit run with Gabriel Santiago. In turn 1, that can be huge. Now again, the chance of this giving you the full 8 credits, -1 for the Embezzle itself, the full 7 credits, is kind of unlikely, but there's some dream scenarios. I think by far the worst part of this card, you have to name one of the 4 types, and there's actually 5 types of cards that the Corp have. The last type is Agenda. So not only if you can't say Agenda, but even if you could say Agenda, if you reveal an Agenda, not only do you not trash it, because that's not an option, but you can't even steal it. You can't steal it, which is just the worst feeling, and I can't wait for somebody to play Embezzle, run HQ, say Operation, and then reveal 2 Agendas, reveal 6 points, and feel really bad about themselves, and it's unfortunate. So how do you play this card, or when would you play this card? And the cool thing that this card does is that it trashes Operations. That alone is actually worth looking at, because that is something that criminals currently can't do. It's something Anarchs largely do the best, but there are operations that pull up in HQ, and it can be predictable what you're playing against. So saying Operation, running HQ on turn 4 or 5, a lot of those times there's operations in there you want to deal with. Say you're playing against a controlling the message deck, say Operation. You run HQ, you'll hit the C sources, you'll hit those hard-hitting news and exchanges of information, you'll get rid of them, and you'll get money at the same time. Seems pretty good. Maybe you're playing against a Tenon Institute deck or any Jateki deck. A lot of times you can say Operation. You'll hit those cards that have been hanging out in hand. Cards like Tricholite or Shimon from Tenon are very easy to predict. And that's some good value, because these are cards that criminal generally can't deal with really well. And removing fast events, let alone getting money doing it, is good. Now, mind you, Embezzle is by no means reliable. Other options, maybe you want to call Ice. I don't know, maybe you play in scheduled maintenance so that the ice pulls up in HQ. Maybe you play Fisk Investment Seminar so they draw a lot of cards all at once, and now they got all this ice. Maybe Embezzle is good for ice. Trashing ice is actually pretty good regardless, but this one seems a bit of a harder sell. I think Operation's going to be happening most of the time. Against an acid-heavy deck, maybe you say HQ, run assets, but a lot of times if they have assets, they just install all of them. I don't know. Generally, Agendas hang out in HQ in those decks, so this seems kind of rough. Now this card does get a lot better if you know what's in HQ, obviously. The more you're guessing with this card, the higher chance it is 1 credit plus break ice equals nothing, and that's really bad. So let's find out what's in HQ, and there's some fair ways to do that. While being a restricted card, Gang Sign lets you passively see what's in HQ. Also, there'll be less agendas in there maybe because Gang Sign clears agendas out, so then you can Embezzle and you know, oh, they have 2 operations, 3 operations, let's go get some money. There's also these cool information cards. Information is a thing that criminals meant to be really good at. Corporate Defector kind of helps with that. You can see what the corp is drawing, so you can Embezzle more accurately. Enhanced Vision, a card I've never seen hit the table, but this is the same kind of ability. You also have Find the Truth, which is a really strong card if you're running criminal and you want to run every turn. You can see what's on top of a R&D. If you can run that if it's an agenda. If not, it'll end up in HQ. You got some good embezzlement. White Hat, a very cool card that came out this cycle, is also pretty sweet. You can see all of HQ, you can trash the cards or shuffle away the cards, that you don't want, and then you get a free Embezzle. And I tried Embezzle and Sunny, and that's kind of the issue with Embezzle and Sunny, is if you can make HQ the 3 cards of your choice, you're generally better off playing Legwork 100% of the time. So this was a really rough sell, let alone it's at more influence. Celebrity Gift, fun counter to that. Show me your hand, I can walk in there and trash things. Maybe they're playing Grail. You can go ahead and trash some ice. That's some cool counter tech. It's also pretty sweet against traps. If you're playing against a deck, you know there's a bunch of snares in there. Say Acid, and not only do you trash the snares and make 4 credits, but they won't fire, because you're not accessing the snares, mind you, you're revealing them. And that's a cool thing, is that you're not accessing cards, so this is technically a pressure card when it comes to cards like Eater, cards that don't get accesses, making this like a mini Wanton Destruction. That is until you realize there's no way to trash agendas, which is the biggest problem, because generally you want to Wanton Destruction agendas. Sometimes it's good to hit away operations, but like Damn. I think the biggest thing that upsets me about this card, not only it's a hard sell to do the chance that this card does nothing, but that I feel like right now the last thing that Criminal needs is more HQ pressure. We're expecting a new account siphon, and obviously that's something that Corps are going to play around, so they're obviously going to be icing HQ. But like, Criminals need more flexibility. So many of their power cards are all about HQ runs. There's D-Res effects, there's money stealing effects, and now there's Embezzle. And imagine Embezzle said make a run on HQ or R&D, and if it's successful, reveal the top 2 cards or reveal 2 cards. How much cooler that would be and how much more flexible. It would be trashing on R&D, it would be multi-axis, and of course I'm just describing a strictly better card, but I feel like Criminal has always just been pigeonholed into running one server over and over again. That it's kind of brain dead to play against them to some extent. You just ice up HQ. Like, you're gonna put a Crisium on HQ anyways against Account Siphon, and now also Embezzle's garbage, and that feels really bad. That feels really rough. And I just wish that there was more flexibility in Criminal and they weren't just printing R&D cards. To their, I guess they did print Mobius on accident. This was meant to say HQ, by the way. Oops. This is a tough sale for me. There's a chance of doing nothing, which is never good. With some information, that's cool, but a lot of times that information, you probably just want to end up legworking because you know where the agendas are. Maybe Embezzle is a cool follow-up, or legwork is a cool follow-up to Embezzle, because you trash 2 cards. Now there's only 3 cards in hand, and maybe you get in that sweet legwork, but I doubt it. This card actually does work well with Turning Wheel for what it's worth, because you are making a run. Next Criminal card, last one in this pack. This is Slipstream. It's a 0-cost virtual resource. Whenever you pass a rezzed piece of ice, you may trash Slipstream. If you do, choose a piece of ice protecting a central server in the same position as the past ice. You are now approaching that ice. Very important to know, positionality, an ice is determined out from the innermost. So the first piece of ice is the ice right outside the server, and then the one next to it is the second, and then the third. So you're not going to be going from the outermost ice onto the innermost ice on any server. You're always going to be staying on the same level. I'm doing a bad job at explaining it. It goes outwards. So the first one is always going to be the first one, and then if the server has ice, it'll have 1 on it. I did a great job. This is Copycat. It's a cool card. Didn't see a lot of play, but a cool card. And there's something very, very important about how the text on these are different. Copycat's a program, it costs a bit more, and when you pass a piece of ice, you can choose another ice after trashing this with the same name. Choose another res copy of that piece of ice, yeah, with the same name, and then the run continues if you've just passed that chosen piece of ice. So you break a piece of ice, and then you pass the other piece of ice on a different server. And Slipstream puts you back 1. It puts you back a piece of ice. So why are you playing Slipstream? Slipstream is at its best when there's one big server. Say you have HQ, it has 3 pieces of ice on it, and you want to run HQ, and then there's only 1 ice on Archives or R&D. So now you can run R&D or Archives. Say you run Archives. So you have Slipstream installed, you run Archives, and now you've hit your first roadblock. If you're running Archives and there's no reason to run Archives, the Corp just doesn't res the ice on Archives, and then you're just running Archives for no reason. That's really bad. Slipstream only works if the Corp reses their ice, and it's not impossible to think of a runner deck that can give a reason for the Corp to res ice on Archives. Maybe you don't install Slipstream yet, and they just want to get the ice up, but there's a chance that this does nothing if the ice is not resed, so be careful about that. But if the ice is resed, you're going to spend money breaking that ice, and now you pass that ice, and now you can go in front, you're approaching the first innermost ice on HQ. So instead of running an HQ with 3 ice, you've gone ahead and ran this other server that you basically built that has 2 ice. In the case of Copycat, you would have just done 1, but basically now instead of running HQ with 3, you're running HQ with 2 ice. So it just saved you 1 ice, which makes it so much worse to me than Inside Job. And Inside Job is a flexible card that's good on any server. It's great turn 1. It lets you rush it out. Sometimes it goes through 2 pieces of ice because it's only good if the Corp reses 1 of the ice on a 2 ice server, and Slipstream just is not economically good. You're spending a card to dodge 1 piece of ice in this scenario where there's 3 ice on server, 1 on another one. Sometimes it's not even going to be that good. I don't get it. It does have a cool combo with spearfishing, and spearfishing I think is also a lot of times just inherently worse than Inside Job. But if you spearfish the innermost ice on a server and you slipstream it to another server, you're spearfishing that ice too. It's clarified in the UFAQ, which is pretty cool, or the UFAQ for slipstream, which is really cool. So if you're running slipstream, you can get through like a server generally for free, and that's probably the best way to play slipstream. But I don't know. I'd rather probably just play Inside Job, and I largely don't get this one. It's also a one-time use, which for 0 is not bad, but it's a one-time use. I wouldn't have been surprised if at some point in the design and the testing of this card, it was a permanent card. It cost a bit more, but as soon as it was on the table, it changed how like the corp installed their ice, and it made things very interesting. But this is a one-shot thing. Another cool thing about this card is that it does not initiate a run itself, so you can use it during a run. But that also largely doesn't matter, because if you're doing a cool run like indexing on R&D and then you slipstream to another server, or say you're embezzling HQ and then you slipstream to another server, this card only works if you make a successful run on R&D, so there's no point. It's cool with cards like Turning Wheel, I guess, but largely, I don't know. And that's another thing. It's like the best case scenario, you'd think Archives wouldn't be iced that well so that you can run HQ, but you should be icing up Archives anyways against Sneak Door Beta. And if your goal was to run Archives to get a cheap run on HQ, just run Sneak Door Beta. I know it costs MU and I know it costs 4 credits, but it's not only permanent, but it just breaks that one ice on Archives we talked about in our dream scenario to get you into HQ for the rest of the game. This also works on remote servers. Say somebody puts one ice on a remote server, now you can get through that one ice, and then if they res it and maybe get into HQ. But putting one ice on a remote server is kind of a bad play in some cases because of things like Bank Job. Maybe that's not worth playing around, but I don't know. I guess this is virtual, which might help with Apex. Apex sometimes struggles to deal with certain pieces of ice when you want to get off the Apocalypse turn, and I could see that being a thing. But overall, it's without Spearfishing, I don't think I'd ever play this card. And even with Spearfishing decks, I think with Spearfishing decks, you probably consider this, but it hinges off that other card that on its own doesn't see a lot of play. Maybe it's so good that you play those two together. But again, just don't res the ice. If they Spearfish Archives, just don't res the Archives ice. And, oh man, that's kind of rough. Again, if this was permanent, it would be very interesting. It would be like playing around Kit, where you want to kind of put your good ice in a good place. Also, you put your best ice on the innermost piece of... When you play against Criminal, you play around Inside Job. Which means if I have 2 ice on HQ, one of them is the good ice I put on the inside, the bad ice I put on the outside. So if you slipstream to past my bad ice on HQ, you still have to deal with my good ice. There's so many things that make this not make sense to me. Please let me know if you disagreed, because I don't see it. This is Lamb. It is it's a really cool card. This is 4 to install. It's a program. It takes up 2 MU. It's an icebreaker and a fractor. It says when you encounter a piece of ice, you may pay 2 credits to have that ice gain barrier until the end of the encounter. You can only use that ability once per turn though. And now it also is just a fractor, so you can pay 2 credits to break any number of barrier subroutines, and 3 credits gives you a whopping 6 strength. It starts at 2 strength, and also only 2 influence means it's a very splashable card. This art is very striking. What's going on here? Lamb is actually, it's a form of folk wrestling. Lamb is also known as Senegalese wrestling. Also, there's French terms, lutte avec frappe. It's a folk wrestling that's traditionally performed by the Surreal people, and it's now the national sport, or a national sport, excuse me, in Senegal and parts of Gambia. If you want to see what it looks like, it looks like the art. It's pretty cool. There's also, if you want to check out, I saw a Vice documentary. They sent one of their reporters to go figure out how to do this, and yeah, if you want to see more in action. But it's dope. It's wrestling. We're going to do some folk wrestling. So 2 things to evaluate about this card. Firstly, how good is it as a fractor? It's honestly not terrible. Shapers aren't particularly great at dealing with barriers, and this deals with big barriers relatively well. If you compare it to the Corset's Battering Ram, this is cheaper, it takes up the same MU, and it's probably a lot of times actually cheaper to use this. Actually, maybe it depends. It depends on the ice you're playing against, but they're definitely comparable. If you're playing Battering Ram, Lamb is an easy decision to also look at. You also have cards like Lady, which might be definitely better, but these need support. I think if you're playing Lamb as your main fractor, you might also want to consider Inti, because Lamb is best at things with a lot of subroutines and things with like higher strength, and Inti is good with low strength. If you're breaking 2 to get through a vanilla is kind of bad, and Inti kind of deals with that a bit better. You also notice this thing here, 2 credits to break any number of barrier subroutines. It's actually pretty sweet. We've been seeing a lot of barriers that have a lot of subroutines. Endless EULA is a pretty great card that just came out last pack, and there's a chance if Lamb gets very popular, Endless EULA starts to look really bad, because at the end of the day, you're breaking this for 2 credits, and that's kind of rough. There's another barrier in the corpse side of this data pack we'll be getting to that also has a really good amount of scaling subroutines. So Lamb has some value against decks with a lot of subroutines. Maybe you have to face against Ashigaru that much, I don't know. This card still exists, yeah, it does. So that's cool. But now we got this thing, which for 2 credits, you can ensure that Lamb will get through the piece of ice. So Lamb says basically a lot of the times, as long as the ice is not more than 8 strength, for 7 credits, you can get through any piece of ice in the game. That's always going to be an interesting thing to consider in Netrunner, because this is a flexible card. On its own, it's a barrier. Barrier breaker, it's a fractor, but it also lets you deal with other ice, which your deck might struggle against, your deck might not be able to break. The fact that this can deal with things like the things that have no subtypes, cards like traps, cards like Mother Goddess, is super valuable, and it means a lot of times you don't have to run an AI in your deck. For instance, like Kit Peddler gets really interesting, right? Like the outermost ice is always going to be a code gate. Then there's going to be other code gates that are going to be installed, and then you can break barriers, and then you can always make once per turn another ice a barrier, and that means there's going to be a lot of situations that you can get through with only 2 breakers. Maybe all you need is a Lamb and a Cyber Cipher. Also, Inversificator gets really cool because now you can stack servers. You can make it a server so that all the barriers are on one server except one ice that's not a barrier. And you can start building situations in which Lamb is very hard to, where it's very easy for this once per turn thing to not be that big of a problem. Maybe put all the barriers on R&D so you can run that many times, and you put the one thing that you want to run once on HQ or something like that. There's also some wild combos here. Server decks have been like really loved by a lot of players who love these like ridiculous combo decks. And the idea with Lamb is you can make any ice a barrier. You can break it, and then you can surf on in. So just Lamb and Surfer means that once per turn, you can get through any server as long as you can break the first piece of ice and then pay 2 credits per every piece of ice as you surf on in. This used to be done with Paintbrush, a card that has rotated that made things barriers. And if you want an example, this might not be the best example of a modern, this is by no means modern, but like what these decks look like, but just with Surfer and now with Lamb, you can actually build a pretty cool deck that runs in and gets into places. It's also totally worth noting that you don't have to use this as your primary fractor. Just having a card that is a fractor that's good against certain things, but also lets you make any piece of ice a fractor, lets you abuse cards that are very good at breaking barriers. The idea is that you can find the most expensive ice, the biggest sentry in the game that you're struggling to deal with. You can pay 2 credits and then break it with Paperclip. Might be very good for your deck. And there's a chance that you want to play Lamb in Anarch and use Paperclip alongside it. This is only a 2 influence card. It also lets you use other wild combos. The idea with Lamb and 2 credits, you can knife any piece of ice in the game. That's wild. I've been trying this. I've been playing a bit of this in Adam and having a lot of fun with it. It also lets you use other weird combo cards. Cards like Ankusa. You can make any low strength ice that you want to bounce 2 credits. And then you can maybe use Ankusa to bounce it back to hand. Now Egret gets cool because you can make anything a barrier and use Lamb to get through it or surf it. It also lets you use other breakers that are not fantastic. Berserker can be good in certain instances. Maybe you pay 2 for Lamb, 2 with this. There's also a chance you do this, where you just make any low piece of ice, a low strength piece of ice, a barrier, and eventually get this nuts fractor. I don't know if you want to do that. I think it's a very promising card. It's very flexible on its own. It's not terrible, and it lets you. It smooths out so many parts of your deck where sometimes you just need one program to deal with a 2 ice server, and that's cool. And it lets you eventually also press for a late game where now you're like, wait, now I can deal with this ice cheaper by using a 2 card combo. That's great. Also, if you've ever been playing any of these decks that run a lot of non-breakers, like for instance, I've been playing a Shaper that runs Bahali and DDoS and Kongamato, all these resources that let you non-permanently break ice. Now I can put 1 Lamb in the deck, and now I have a way to deal with 1 or 2 problematic ice a run or any amount of barriers, and that opens up a lot of things that the deck can do by only taking up 1 card slot, and I think that's really worth looking at. It's a very flexible card. I think we'll be seeing this one for a while, and this is going to be very exciting for a lot of the sort of players that like to build ridiculous combos with a lot of programs, and then they have this crazy engine, and it's always fun to see. This is Gabriel Celessi. It's a mod, it's a hardware, it's unique. You only get 1. It only costs 1 to install. And you can host Gabriel Celessi on an installed non-AI Icebreaker. And the host Icebreaker returns to its base strength at the end of each turn, rather than each encounter. Go for the distance. 4 influence. Just before I forget, also Lamb, Dinosaur. It's not bad. It's really this isn't bad at all. This breaks through any ice. It's a upfront cost. It doesn't take up the MU. 4 strength. Let's do it. Anywho, Gabriel Celessi. It's a cool name. What's that about? Well, actually, Haile Gebrselassie was an Ethiopian long-distance track runner, road running athlete. Gebrselassie won 2 Olympic gold medals for over 10,000 meters, 4 world championship titles, won the Berlin Marathon, set a bunch of records. They set the Berlin Marathon world record and then broke his own record by 27 seconds. Really cool dude, well-spoken in interviews and stuff. There's actually this famous clip here where they're running in the 1992 10,000 meter World Juniors, and the dude that he's running against really did not care for him apparently and ended up punching him in the back of the head, which actually pushed him across the finish line even faster, which good for him, I guess. Interestingly enough, this name is also similar with another name I was kind of aware of, which is Haile Selassie, who was an Ethiopian regent in the early 20th century, but it's this guy. Again, we're going for the distance, 10,000 meters worth of world championship distance. So what does this card do? Keeps your strength up. And that's good if you're going for distance. You get most value with this if you're using a card over and over again, and you're over and over again spending a lot of money boosting its strength. And again, we just talked about Lamb, and that's kind of one of the best candidates. It's not hard for you to see in a run that you would boost the strength with this. You'd pay 3, which is a lot, to boost the strength of Lamb, and then the next ice you encounter, you'll make it a barrier, and this will already be at the 8 strength you needed to. So there's a cool combination here. But this also works with other things. Like, I think Switchblade is probably one of the best combos. Switchblade gets a massive swing of strength for just 1 stealth credit, and sometimes you want to save your stealth credits, so you can have a 7 strength stealth Switchblade for the whole turn, and maybe that's all you need to make sure that you have enough stealth credits. I don't know whether having enough stealth credits is modernly a problem with stealth decks, but this is the sort of thing you want to do. And what can you do on a turn that you're going for the distance? To get value out of Gebrselassie, you want to be running 2 or 3 times a turn, just because otherwise, what was the point? If you're running once a turn, there's no reason to have Gebrselassie, I guess, unless there's 2 centuries in a row. So why are you running a lot? Cards like Equivocation are good. Maybe you're running R&D 3-4 times a turn, forcing the corp to draw, seeing a lot of new cards. I think Notoriety is one of the most fun reasons. If you want to run every Central Server turn just to get the Notoriety off, you might as well save the money so you don't have to boost your breakers more than once, and that's pretty great. It's also really good against like the taxing remote strategies that want to make you run more than once. Cards like Ash embody that really well. You run through a server, have to do a trace, run again. You're saving a fair bit of money with Gebrselassie, and also cards like Marcus Batty to some extent do the same idea. I think a cool part about the design of Gebrselassie that makes me more excited to play it than other cards like Personal Touch that have a somewhat similar effect is that this is the first time that we've seen a mod that you install on the table and then spend a click to install it onto a program. And that means that if you don't draw your stuff in the right order, you don't draw your program, you draw your Gebrselassie first, you can still dump it on the table, and then once you need it, you have to spend a click attaching it to a program. And that does make it slower in some ways, but it makes it a lot more flexible. You can also move it from a host program to another host program once you get a better option, or once you have a better understanding of what the corpse ice looks like, and you understand it'll be better if I keep my sentry up because they're running more sentries. Personal Touch is just, you need to draw things in the right order. All that being said, we've seen this ability before on cards. And System Seizure is a current, and there's some value in that for sure, but I haven't actually seen this card ever see very compelling play, and it's largely the same idea. This one's a bit less flexible because it's the first icebreaker, and having a current has some value, but I haven't seen it just yet. This sort of archetype of shaper that runs a lot just hasn't come to fruition just yet, but I think we might see it more. We've seen other cards like Marathon too that make running more often more appealing. Sometimes you want to run the same remote server twice for some reason because I can, or I don't know. That one doesn't make that much sense, but it's definitely coming together, and I think that's cool. Also totally worth knowing, this does not in any way combo with Dean Lister. Dean Lister and Gebrselassie, they just don't work together. Check out the page for Gebrselassie or check out the UFAQ for this pack to see how it is. But if you boost with Dean Lister, it resets. It just doesn't work like that. That's cool. Last Shaper card is an event called Compile. I think we've seen a fair bit of run events. Oh no, maybe we've only seen 2 this pack, but this is Compile. It's a Shaper run event, great art by Liga. It says make a run. The first time you encounter a piece of ice during this run, you may search your stack or heap for a program and install it, ignoring all costs. When the run ends, add that program to the bottom of your stack if it is still installed at 3 influence. Wow. So, I'm not a big Shaper player. I just never have been. It doesn't really appeal to me, but this card I'm actually more excited about than I thought it would be. And it's very easily comparable to Test Run. Test Run's the same idea. Test Run is a card that does see play. It has some pretty cool combos associated with it, but it's subtly different. And let's see how they are different. Test Run costs more. It doesn't make a run, but when you're done with the program, it puts it on top of your stack. It also lets you install things from your heap, which is really important. And say you're installing a program to make a run on a server, that's what you want to do. You want to get your breaker out and charge a server. Compile is actually considerably better. While it might be a bit clumsy because you can only choose during the first ice encounter. Also, if they don't res anything, it does nothing, but that's probably fine if they don't res anything, right? If they only, sorry, this only fires on the first ice that you encounter, which means that if you don't know what the next piece of ice is, you have to do some guesswork. But it saves you not only a credit, but it also saves you a click, and that's worth looking at. The question is also whether you will rather have the thing that you test run or you compile on the top of your deck at the bottom. And at the bottom of your deck doesn't have a lot of synergy. The best synergy is Window, but it's going to take so much for this card to actually be worth playing. I don't think this is the card that we were looking for. But I actually would argue that putting a card on the bottom of your deck in a lot of cases that you can fabricate is better than test run putting it at the top. And that's because you maybe don't want to draw your programs because your deck relies on compile. And this gets interesting. This is a lady, and if you're playing compile to install a lady, you install it for free. The lady is probably going to use itself up, and at the end of the day, your lady goes back to the bottom of your deck. And that means you can use your lady again. If you put it on the top of your deck, it means you're going to draw it, and a lot of times you don't want to draw this right away. I don't know, maybe sometimes you do. But it just lets you compile it over and over again, because as soon as you draw your lady, compile doesn't do anything with it. And I think maybe one of the best cases is David. You can play 4 influence in your Shaper deck for a compile, and you can make sure that your David always stays at the bottom of your deck, and whenever you need it, you compile for your David, and it's always going to reset, and you're always going to have access to it, whether you need to panic it out for the self-modifying code, or you do have your next compile. And you also know you're never going to draw it, which sometimes is something you actually want to do. I think compile might to me be the most exciting in one of those decks that I talked about before that runs Kanghamana and Bahali, because I love the idea of compiling an Overmind, putting it on the bottom of my deck and never drawing it. Because I always want to have access to it, but I never want to draw it, which might sound a bit convoluted, but I'm actually kind of into it. And only paying 2 credits and making a run at the same time is pretty cool. If it's not comparable to test run, it's arguably better in a very specific way. This card's also pretty dope when it comes to cards that have one-time use, cards like Grappling Hook that will trash themselves. You use your Grappling Hook in your Kanghamana deck, you got it out in 1 click anyways, you're all nice and good. It also works with things like Tripano that we just looked at, if that's the combo deck where you want to install something and you have 5 Hive Mind counters and something dies. It's also very much worth noting that Tripano or Compile and Femme Fatale actually don't really work well together. You might think that you can compile and counter a piece of ice, install Femme Fatale, bypass it. It doesn't work due to the fact that you've already encountered the ice, so you can't fire this when you encounter ability. If that's not clear to you, please ask in the questions or the comments below, we can clarify that. So this isn't the best, but compiling out big programs is good. The idea that if there's a 2-ice server, you can in theory compile out a mass driver, which is a bit expensive to use, but a lot of times will let you get through 2 pieces of ice. Not only is that a cool trick suddenly that comes out of nowhere with the Shaper, but you'll never draw this kind of largely not great 8-cost card. It will always stay on the bottom of your deck. And that's pretty sweet, because you generally never want to draw this card. If you can just keep it at the bottom of your deck as a panic button, that's cool. It's also good for cards like Rosetta, if you want to keep cards in your deck anyways. I don't know. I find this card way cooler than I thought it was, even though I'm not a big Shaper player. But I like the idea of having a switch that lets me pull out this absurd answer to something that I'm never going to draw that answer. It's always going to be there as long as I have access to compile. And I could see myself playing multiple Overminds in a game over and over again. And you'll never know whether or not you're safe. And I kind of like that a lot. This is our final Adam card for this cycle. It's called Logic Bomb. It's a virtual resource, it costs nothing to install, it's a whopping 5 influence, and it says trash. Bypass the piece of ice you're currently encountering, lose any remaining clicks. Could God create a stone so heavy he could not lift it? This also might be the first Neverwinter card that actually says the word God on it, but I might be wrong. There was a couple like religious cards. Yeah, this is an unconditionally fantastic card. Unconditionally fantastic. It deals with 1 piece of ice. It costs 0 to install though, and it does have a drawback, but it's just really good. It's really good. We've seen Always Be Running, and you can, it's very important for Adam, specifically Adam decks, to get early accesses to find the agendas. And you could start with Always Be Running. A lot of Adam decks modernly, at least in competitive scene, don't like starting with this card because it is very limiting. But the idea is that turn 1, you can have a Logic Bomb, you can get into HQ, you can get that good double access when you have cards like, what's it called? The other directive that I don't know the name of. We'll find it if we keep cycling through this, won't we? Yeah, Neutralize All Threats. You get 2 accesses, you get the agenda, and then your brain chip is online. And that is all you need. Once you get your brain chip online, Adam is getting free card draw a lot of times. Your MU is huge. It's fantastic. You can't get rushed out. Also, if you run Adam, you can run Archives, you can run some remote and see what's on top of R&D. And sometimes all you need is one card that you install, costs 0 credits, run R&D, get that agenda you're on. And that is such good early pressure. It's nuts. It's really, really good. It's also a really easy card to install in turn 1. And with Adam, if you're playing with safety first, you want to get down to 2 cards by the end of turn 1 so you get a free card draw. And having a card that you can install and forget that costs you 0, great. It's so easy to install, very little of a tempo loss, and it scares the shit out of the corp. Now, they understand it's a one-time use. Once you use this, they can't use it again, but you generally have 3 of these in your deck, so good luck. And once you got that agenda, your brain chip's online, you're drawing cards. It does have some counterplay. Cards like Ikawa Project, cards like Strongbox are hard to deal with because you don't have clicks to steal these things. Not that Strongbox is even that popular. There's also like, oh man, what's the name of this card? There's also some other cards you can combo with this if you're worried that the drawback is too strong. I've seen some people play Temple of Liberated Mind in their Adam decks, just so some turns they can have a click left. So if they do run a remote server and have to use Logic Bomb, they can have a click left to remove a tag, per se, and that's kind of cool. Unconditionally strong card. Fantastic card. It is a 0 cost card, which means best defense can't trash it, but Adam is weak against best defense anyways. Maybe whether or not you have to pack that is kind of crazy. It's good. For 5 influence, do I think we're going to see it outside of Adam? I think largely not. And that's just because the same sort of idea is present in other cards that are only 1 influence. And Kangamato and Gabahali kind of do what Logic Bomb does. Not exactly. But I think you'd rather splash these. And also you can run an Adam deck that just runs 3 Kangamato, 3 Gabahali, 3 DDoS, 3 Logic Bomb. And it's probably a fine deck. And you can probably get through most dice for a long time. It's good. It's unconditionally good. Don't have much to say about that. The art's great too. Last runner card. This is called Jackpot. Resource 0 Jackpot with an exclamation mark. When your turn begins, you may place a credit on Jackpot. Whenever an agenda is added to your score area, you may take any number of credits from Jackpot. And if you do, you go ahead and trash Jackpot. In the flavor text is obviously Jackpot. It's fully neutral. Nothing to install, no to put in your deck. I love cards that have punctuation in them. We haven't seen a lot of it, but it's actually been a trend. Well, we've seen some, like Snare and It's a Trap, I think. It's actually kind of a tradition. This is basically the sure gamble of the original Netrunner, OG Netrunner. It's called Score, and this is the same sort of idea. Whether or not it's a direct homage, I love it. The idea of just yelling something when you install it seems really fun. So how good is Jackpot? It gives you 1 credit a turn sometimes. Only after you add an agenda to your score area. So generally you're stealing agenda or you're doing something cool. And 1 credit per turn is really good. For sure it's really good. Cards like Data Folding are fantastic. You get this down turn 1, you get down Underworld Contact turn 1. You're in a really good spot because by the end of the game, this probably made you 15 to 16 credits. And Jackpot is much cheaper than Data Folding to install for sure, but actually won't do anything to your board state unless you're already doing something all right. And at that point, it will give you money. And I don't know how great that is. It's also not permanent. While there are conditions attached to Data Folding and Underworld Contact, once you get them on the table, they're going to give you money until the game is over. They're also bad to install when medium, or they're pretty bad to install when you draw late in the game, same with Jackpot, so that's going to happen no matter what. But I love the idea that I install Underworld turn 1 if I have 2 link per se, and you're good. And Jackpot just seems a lot more conditional to me and doesn't give you money right away, which helps you build the board state so that you can get in and then steal those agendas. And that kind of doesn't excite me that much. It's really hard to balance cards like this because as soon as you print a card that gives you 1 credit per turn, it's going to be immediately compared to Data Folding and Underworld Contacts, which are really, really good cards. So it's now whether I'd rather play Jackpot or our Contacts, and I like this card a lot better a lot of times, but as soon as it says something like 2 credits per turn, it gets absolutely busted and banned from the game for good reasons because it's crazy. So I don't know. I think it's largely going to be difficult for me to pay 1 credit. Why do I have Hive up here? I don't know. Yeah. I think it's also really important though, and this is something that should be really exciting for anybody who plays Netrunner, is anytime this game prints neutral economy, that's fantastic. Because neutral economy makes every deck in the game better. You could be running a wild combo, whatever, shaper with all these programs, your professor deck. And at the end of the day, having more neutral cards you can cram into your deck is fantastic. We already have Daily Cast, which gives you 5 credits. So how many credits does Jackpot have to give you to be good? And I don't know. It's also worth noting when you add an agenda to your score area where also you can trigger that. You can have it so you're playing Fansight with Jackpot, but now you're playing a 2-card combo that sometimes gives you like 3-4 credits when the corp scores. I guess you can choose not to use it, but it's not fantastic. There's also an issue here where the fact that this is a 0-cost resource that you're depending on to some extent for money is kind of like algo trading in Shaper. And a lot of times this thing can just get best defensed. Whether or not that's popular in your meta, that's up to you. But it makes it hard to rely on because it actually, the 0 cost is to some extent a liability. I would definitely best defense this if it had 7 credits on it. No doubt. Yeah, I don't know. Sure Gamble's good, huh? It's weird how little energy I have about this one. It's neutral economy. It's really good turn 1 if you get it down, just like all the installables. With Haley, that's cool. Haley installs this and Fansight, which is pretty good. Again, you're going to use your Fansight for other things in the Haley deck, so it's not like you're including Fansight just as a joke. But is that better than other economy options? I don't know. I want my money now. I really want my money now. I think that's the biggest thing. I don't want to have control over when I get it, because I need that money to get agendas. Maybe that's why you run Fansight. That's Jackpot. It's neutral economy, so I think we might see this for a while in decks, and then people are going to figure out whether or not that's better than Daily Casts. I like Daily Casts a lot. I'll career fair this out and gain 8 credits. That's Whisters in Nullabali. We got 10 cards, a lot of really strong Anarch stuff. I'm really excited for all those viruses. Let's not talk about the blue stuff. The green stuff's also really cool. I think Lamb is a really interesting card. I'm very excited about it, and this is so nuts. Let me know what cards you're excited to play with. Let me know what decks you're building in the comments below. We'll be back real soon, hopefully, with the Corp side of this pack. We got 10 cards, and they're also really interesting, too. Otherwise, this cycle's going to be wrapping up in one more data pack, and let me tell you, Kampala Ascendant, it's going to be off the chain. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned. Ciao.